This is an epic disaster movie about ancient Egypt. The Egyptian pharaohs enslaved the Hebrews through the ages for over 400 years. The Hebrew gods were outraged by this brutal rule. To punish the Egyptian pharaoh and avenge the 400,000 Hebrews, Hebrew gods decided to send 10 plagues to Egypt. Soon, the first disaster came quietly from the Nile. Suddenly the fishermen who were still working were attacked by giant crocodiles. Countless beasts emerged from the water and slaughtered people. Every person dragged into the water becomes a meal for the crocodiles. In an instant, no fisherman working on the river survived. From then on, no one dared to set foot on the Nile. However, this was only the beginning of the 10 plagues. The second disaster was all the fish that lived in Egyptian waters. In the morning, fish carcasses on the river's surface covered the entire river. The scarlet blood eventually contaminated all of Egypt's water resources. Not only were the creatures that lived in the water exterminated, the water flowing into the farmlands also destroyed the food that the people worked so hard for. This was a very painful blow to the proletariat. For this reason, the pharaoh made rituals to ask the gods to purify the water for them, but they have yet to receive an answer from the goddess Kabajit. An even more horrific third disaster came. Horrifying frogs crawled to the surface from the bottom of the water in great numbers. The water environment they depend on is polluted, forcing them to come ashore and sweep into the streets to survive. Inside the palace, the sleeping queen is suddenly awakened by frogs. Countless frogs have taken over the entire room. The frogs, deprived of water, soon die in every corner of human habitation, leading to an even more heinous fourth disaster. The rotting bodies of the frogs create a haven for flies to feed on. Flies began to swarm into human dwellings. Not only was scarce meat consumed by the contamination, but the swarms of flies also attacked the humans. A black cloud of flies swept over most of the human space. Even the air was filled with a disgusting stench that was hard to breathe. The pharaoh called an emergency meeting in the Great Hall. The ministers thought that if they survived this wave of natural disasters, the flies would die a natural death like the frogs. But before the fourth disaster had fully dissipated, the fifth disaster began to spread rapidly from the human race. A sudden plague killed and injured the Egyptian people overnight. Not only did the virus spread quickly, but it also festered the skin of everyone, including those of the royal family and nobility. They got a white horse from the Hebrews. The white horse had a message that the disaster would not end but would worsen. If 400,000 Hebrews could be released to go home, it would solve all the disasters. Everyone thought it was the will of God, but the Egyptian pharaoh didn't believe in any gods at all. He thought he was God. Not only did he not release all the Hebrews, but he doubled their workload. Pharaoh took out all his anger on the Hebrews. This undoubtedly angered the Hebrew gods again and sent a sixth disaster on them. All the livestock in Egypt suddenly died a violent death. The people could hardly breathe as a result of the successive plagues. Even the Egyptian pharaoh's beloved horses were not spared. The grief-stricken pharaoh again called in the sorcerers to explain the disaster, but these sudden calamities were far beyond the sorcerer's comprehension. To explain, he explained to the pharaoh as he had done last time. When the catastrophe had reached a certain point, all would be calm again. However, the pharaoh had already endured this explanation for a long time. He took the sorcerer to the square and executed a brutal execution. Then the pharaoh called on the priest again to find a solution to the disaster, but the priest had prayed to the 6 gods many times, but there was no answer. Pharaoh could no longer bear these superstitious lies. Enraged, he took the priest out in front of a large crowd and executed her immediately. As night fell, the dark sky was suddenly filled with lightning and thunder, and a violent rainstorm began to fall. A strange hailstorm, mixed with heavy rain, pelted the statue of Kabajit. A rare hailstorm on a June day. This was the 7th disaster sent down on Egypt by the god Hebrew. The hailstorm destroyed all the houses and crops and extinguished the last vestiges of hope for all the people left. Pharaoh looked up to the sky and saw the strange storm coming. He blamed himself for bringing Egypt to its knees. His heart seemed to waver as he wanted to be surrendered to the Hebrew gods. A Hebrew cursed at the heavens. Despite the help of the gods, it was the common people who ended up dying as a result of the disaster. He didn't know whom the gods were punishing by sending these disasters. He only hoped that from this moment on, all the disasters would be put to rest. Suddenly the god Hebrew stood behind him in the form of a child. It also showed that the 8th disaster would come the next morning as scheduled. Locusts swarmed across the sky. All the people had to abandon their food and flee from their fields in panic. In a flash, the locusts gnawed away at all the crops. From the wilderness, the locusts moved in swarms to the lavish palaces of Egypt. Even the sacred palaces were not immune to the locusts. Over 10 million square kilometers of crops have been destroyed. By now, the common people of Egypt were eating wild vegetables and tree bark. The quartermaster advised the pharaoh to give some of the food to the people to tide them over. When the disaster was over, taxes would be raised to replenish granaries, but the selfish pharaoh decisively refused, and so it would soon come to pass that the gods of Hebrew sent the ninth disaster down on Egypt. Hungry commoners stormed the treasury to loot the grain. In doing so, they, unfortunately, set fire to the entire granary. All the grain in the treasury was destroyed. Those who managed to escape from the gates with the grain were not spared. The pharaoh sent a team of archers to surround them all. The civilians who took the food were punished with their lives. In an instant, the palace was filled with wailing, but all this was seen by the Hebrew gods. Then the ninth disaster sent down a great thunderbolt that instantly wiped out Pharaoh's regiment. Once again, God Hebrew came to the people as a child. He sent for a Hebrew man called Moses. He told him to go and negotiate with Pharaoh to free 400,000 Hebrews and lead them out of Egypt and back to their homeland. Otherwise, the 10th disaster would be more severe than the previous 9 combined. The next day, Moses approached Pharaoh and told him of the demands and consequences of the negotiation. If the negotiations were accepted before the sun went down, there would be hope for the future fate of Egypt. The stubborn Pharaoh still did not accept all the threats, and so the 10th disaster came quietly in the dead of night after everyone had fallen asleep. It turned out that Ramses had already harbored a grudge and jealousy against Moses over divination. This was all because of the war waged by Egypt against the Hittite kingdom, which led to the breakdown of relations between them. It was the Battle of Kadesh, which has gone down in ancient Egyptian history, one of the most powerful battles I have ever seen. Prince Ramses of Egypt led a raid on the Hittite border with 2,000 chariots and 16,000 infantry, thus contesting the main Hittite bases and forts in Syria. However, the Hittite kingdom, which had received advance information, had already sent nearly 20,000 troops to the border. Ramses sent half his troops to attack from the rear while he led the chariot attack from the front. The urgent reports from the garrison signaled that the battle was about to begin. The soldiers, still at lunch, immediately took up their weapons and prepared for battle. The Egyptian chariots came in full armor. At Ramses' command, the archers behind him launched the first wave of attacks on the enemy's charging cavalry. Before the two armies could engage, the Hittite vanguard lost more than half its military. Before the enemy could react, the Egyptian archers launched a second wave of attacks on the enemy. All the infantry had to take up their shields and line up in a human line of defense, but this was no match for the speeding wagons. Almost all of them became dead under the wheels in a matter of seconds. The enemy was in disarray and had lost their first line of defense. The Egyptian knights, who had been in the rear, began to attack. At the command of General Moses, the knights rushed towards the enemy camp, attacking from the front and back. The Egyptian army surrounded the Hittite garrison, but the enemy soon targeted Ramses. The first to charge into the enemy's camp, an arrow from the enemy killed the driver of his horse. Ramses can only operate the wagon and fight at the same time. This greatly reduced his ability to fight. Soon the enemy came crashing down on his chariot from the rear. Ramses' chariot was reduced to a single wheel. Another wagon came hurtling towards him from the front. Ramses is knocked off his feet and onto his back. While struggling to kill the enemy, Moses notices his brother is in danger. Having lost his carriage, Ramses fought his way back to his feet. Just as he was about to take up his weapon, another heavily armed carriage came at him with purpose. In the nick of time, Moses managed to save him by jamming his lance into the enemy's wheel. Unbeknownst to him, this act by General Moses eventually planted the seeds of Ramses' hatred for him. It turns out that before setting off for war, Egypt has a traditional ritual that has been handed down for centuries. A goose had to be killed before the war started. Then, the goose's liver was sacrificed to divine the expedition's fate, but the result was a great disappointment to all present. Instead of a bad omen, the shaman divined another, more important prophecy, that Ramses will be saved by another person in the war, and the man who saves Ramses will be the next ruler of Egypt. Everyone thought this was a great joke played on Egypt by the gods. Only the Egyptian prince Ramses kept the prophecy of the priests buried in his heart. He kept the matter very much on his guard, but the prophecy had come true after all. At the moment, he had no desire to fight and turned his attention to the one who had saved him. Then he took his spear and prepared to throw it at Moses. Moses, still fighting, seemed to see his action with his eyes, but he did not react, not even daring to look up at Ramses. Instead of hiding from his destiny, he would have killed more enemies on the battlefield. In a panic, other soldiers unexpectedly pulled Ramses onto the chariot. The Battle of Kadesh was over. The soldiers all began to retreat from the enemy camp. The battle was a great success. The people waiting along the road greeted the soldiers with loud cheers and welcomed them home. Back at the palace, the pharaoh approached Moses for a private talk. His son Ramses had not said a word since the end of the war. He pressed Moses to find out if he had been hiding anything from him all this time. In desperation, Moses told the Pharaoh that the prophecy had been fulfilled. However, Pharaoh was very calm. He even thought that Moses would be a better ruler than Ramses. But after all, Moses was not of his blood, so the prophecy could not be fulfilled, and Moses would not be able to inherit the throne. Ramses criticized by father for poor performance in battle, plus the prophecy haunted him. He planted the seeds of hatred towards his good brother Moses. To avert the devastating 10th disaster, the Egyptian pharaoh couldn't take it anymore. He decided to give in to the Hebrew gods. He promised to release the Hebrews, who had been enslaved for 400 years, and allow them to return home. Led by Moses, 400,000 Hebrews set out en masse to return to their homeland. They had been waiting for this day for over 400 years, but soon after they left Egypt, Pharaoh went back on his word and prepared to slaughter 400,000 enslaved people. Spies rushed to tell Moses that Pharaoh was coming from behind with hundreds of thousands of troops. Desperate to escape the pursuers, they took the mountain route. They walked for 3 days and nights. They ended up on a beach in the middle of nowhere, faced with a desperate situation. Everyone chooses to wait on the beach for death to come. Then they were left to the heavens to decide their fate. However, the next day they woke up to a bizarre phenomenon. The scene before them dazzled the 400,000 people present. Last night's ocean had miraculously ebbed, and land had gradually emerged from the surface. The Moses firmly believed that this was the way back to their homeland opened up by the Hebrew God, so he told everyone to follow him across the shore. Under Moses' leadership, 400,000 Hebrews set off one by one toward the sea. Pharaoh followed their trail at that moment with an army of hundreds of thousands. They had the misfortune of being caught in a collapse as they crossed a narrow mountain road. Before they could catch up with the Hebrews, half of their army had been lost. The Hebrews who had crossed the strait had reached the middle of the sea, but soon they found that Pharaoh's legions had also come after them. Moses immediately told the others to speed up the crossing. Then he sent a limited number of cavalry to follow him and confront Pharaoh's legions. Hundreds of thousands of troops were chasing frantically toward the sea, but just as they were about to meet each other, once again, a strange sight appeared in the dark cloud-covered sky. Suddenly, lightning flashed in the distance, and a storm swept through the sky at 100 meters per second. In this extreme weather, the Egyptian army did not stop its attack, and the worst was yet to come. Just as all the Hebrews reached the other side of the strait, 100-meter-high waves swept toward the humans in the distance, and still, the Pharaoh's army was coming after the enslaved people. In the face of this devastating disaster, the general behind him disobeyed Pharaoh's orders and immediately ordered all his men to turn back and take refuge. Moses also had all the cavalry that had followed him leave the area, and the mad Pharaoh made a desperate attempt to charge across the field. Moses and Pharaoh were the only two left on the battlefield. The two former brothers decided to fight to the death at this point. With the tumbling waves close at hand, Pharaoh Ramses drew his sword and finally charged at Moses. By now the retreating legions were all but covered by the monstrous wave. The humans were defenseless against the cataclysm. In an instant, hundreds of thousands of troops were swallowed up by the sea, and no one was spared. The 10th disaster sent by the Hebrew gods to the Egyptians was finally fulfilled, and Pharaoh and Moses were swallowed by the sea. The waves came crashing down on the enslaved people at the same time. Fortunately, everyone had made it to shore early enough to escape. The bodies of countless soldiers floated in the water. After the pacification, the Hebrew people were the only ones who survived the disaster. Eventually, Moses fought his way up from the sea to the shore. He lived up to the trust of 400,000 enslaved people. He managed to help them escape from the prison they had been holding for over 400 years. Across the coast, Pharaoh Ramses also survived. In contrast to the Hebrews, his Egyptian legions all died, watching the dead soldiers being gnawed on by vultures before his eyes. At this moment, his heart was overwhelmed with guilt. In the end, Moses brought the enslaved people back to their homeland of Canaan. This is the film's end, so subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time.